Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel and welcome back. In this video, we're going to go over 5 different reasons why you should learn SQL instead of always relying on an ORM to interact with a database from a web application. Before we get started, I want to preface this by saying that I'm not trying to make a point of not using an ORM or that you should use it inside of your projects, but rather that you should learn SQL even if you end up using an ORM on your projects. The first reason why you should learn SQL is that you only learn it once and you can apply your knowledge across all languages and frameworks. My point here is that since I've learned to program, I've learned a bunch of different ORMs. I've learned Eloquent in the Laravel ecosystem. I've learned SQLize, Objection.js, and TypeORM in the JavaScript ecosystem. I've learned Ecto in the Phoenix ecosystem, and I've also learned Active Record in the Rails ecosystem. And the fact of the matter is that I only remember how to use Ecto because it is still fresh on my mind. I've been playing around with Phoenix and Elixir these last couple of months, and because of that, I still remember how to use Ecto. I still remember all of the APIs, which is not the case with all the other ORMs. If I wanted, for example, to jump into, let's say, Objection.js, which I recall using in the past, I would need to go to the documentation and see how Objection.js does all of the interactivity with a database, and all of my knowledge of SQL wouldn't really be applied to Objection.js, but rather I would need to understand how the APIs work when it comes to communicating between Objection.js and a SQL database like PostgreSQL. But if you decide to learn SQL, you can easily jump into a Go project, into a Rust project, an Elixir project, or a JavaScript project, and you can interact with a database by using raw SQL queries instead of having to rely on an ORM all the time. Next, the second reason you should learn SQL is because it makes it easier to use ORMs. So, like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not trying to make a point here that you should never use an ORM, but instead you should learn SQL because even if you do decide to use an ORM, it is going to make your job as a web developer much easier. So, like it says here, good ORMs, in my opinion, have APIs that more closely map directly to SQL database features. And this means that they don't abstract away too much. If we take a look at the documentation of Ecto, an ORM in the Elixir ecosystem, as you can see, we have this function that's called unique constraint. And like the documentation says, this checks for a unique constraint in the given field or list of fields. But the cool thing about Ecto is that the unique constraint works by relying on the database to check if the unique constraint has been violated or not, and if so, Ecto converts it into a change set error. So what this function essentially does is it looks and sees if the database returned a unique violation, and then it generates the appropriate error to show to the end user. And the first thing that we need to do, like the documentation says, is we need to create a unique index inside of a migration file. Now, if we don't know SQL and if we don't know what a unique index is at all, this might be very confusing to us. But if we understand SQL, we can read this documentation and quickly realize what's happening here. We first of all need to create inside of, for example, a PostgreSQL database, a unique index. So we create that unique index on a table and we specify what the columns are going to be and what the name is going to be. And then this unique constraint function takes care of the rest. Then we have other ORMs that don't work in the same way. In the Laravel ecosystem, if we want to check for the uniqueness of something inside of the database before creating it, we have to rely on validation. That's usually the way things are done in Laravel. Now, I'm not a Laravel expert, so if you are and you think there's a better way of doing this, please let me know in the comments below. But as far as I'm concerned, usually inside of the Laravel ecosystem, this is the way things are done. So we need to have some sort of validation, and then we specify here that we want this to be unique. We can also specify here the model and then the column name. And since I'm not a Laravel expert, I've asked ChatGPT, how does Laravel implement the unique validation rule? Does it query the database? And the response was yes, Laravel's unique validation rule does query the database to check whether a given value already exists in a specified column of a table. And like it says here, this is going to generate the following query. It's going to say here select count from users, where the email address is the email address that we specify, which is not the best way to do this because we could be relying on the native features of the SQL database instead of having to do a select and only then being able to insert something into the database. But before we continue, if you want to learn more about how to build web applications with HTMX, Go, and PostgreSQL, then go to webdevfuel.com/HGSB or click the link in the description down below. So again, we have this Elixir Ecto way of doing things, which is a nice middle ground in my opinion. So we have here this change function, we pass in the change set, then we also might want to grab here the attributes, and then we use this unique constraint function to be able to tell the end user. So this is going to essentially place this error if it occurs inside of the change set errors. Now, if you're not familiar with Ecto, that might be something foreign to you, but it essentially allows us to convert that database error into something that we can check for inside of our Elixir code. And then in the Laravel ecosystem, we would do something like this. So we would grab here the request and then use this validate method. And then we would use here required and then unique on the post table. And then we would also have here other validation rules. But the thing here is we don't even need to specify a unique index inside of the database for this to work, which creates sort of a separation between our code and the database, which I don't think is good. And the best implementation, in my opinion, would be to use something like Go, where we could execute here a query where we say insert into users, we specify here the column name, and then we pass here the argument, and then we check to see if the error is different than nil. And by using the pgx package, we could initialize here a new Postgres error, and then we could check to see if this error is of this type. And after doing this, we will get access here to the Postgres error message and the code. And in this case, if we wanted to check for a unique violation error, we would check for this code, and it would also have this condition name. Now you might be wondering where we can check for these error codes that PostgreSQL returns, and the answer is pretty simple. We need to check the documentation. So we have here all of the PostgreSQL error codes, and if we search here for 23 and then 505, as you can see, this has this name here of unique violation, and this is the error that is going to be returned if we try to, for example, insert an email address that already exists after we create a unique index for a table on a column name. Next, the third reason you should learn SQL is because you can still use it alongside an ORM. And this is a very important point, and that is you don't need to always pick and choose between SQL or an ORM. You don't need to think that something is better than the other all the time. These are only tools that we can use to our advantage as web developers, and if we learn how to use SQL and we also learn how to use an ORM, we can use them both at the same time where it makes more sense. Like it says here, it's also possible to always go down an abstraction level and just run raw SQL queries. But the important thing here is that this argument only works if we know how to use it. So if you're a web developer and you are working within a code base, and you don't have the ability to go down an abstraction level because you don't understand how SQL works, then that might be a problem in the future. And this also ties into the fourth reason, which is it's important to know a crucial part of any web application. So the database is a crucial part of any web application. Most of the stuff that we are doing is we are grabbing data from an end user and we are sticking it into a database. That's mostly the work that we do as web developers when we are building web application. And if you never touch raw SQL during, let's say, 95% of your time developing a web application, those 5% of debugging require knowledge, and otherwise it's just magic and it is unsolvable. So if you get some sort of error inside of your ORM, you will not be able to understand what that error is, and that's a bad sign, because again, it's important to know a crucial part of any web application, which is the database. The database is a very important part of a web application. It is an important part that we should understand, and without the database working correctly, our web application won't work at all. And because of that, it is important for us to know exactly what's happening. We don't need to understand all things related to our web application, but here the database is a very crucial part, and it is important for us to try to better understand it. And the final reason is that while ORMs are great to get started, as complexity increases, you'll be adapting your code to the ORM and not the other way around. And this is a very common experience for people working with larger projects or even working on a project for a longer time. We start our project, we bootstrap it with Laravel or Rails, and then we start using an ORM, and it feels really great because all of the stuff that they provide us with are very simple to use. We can insert things into the database, we can query something from a table, and it is all very simple to use, and it feels really nice. But as the complexity of a project increases, as the features start getting more complex, then using an ORM is not enough anymore, and my experience has been that we end up adapting our code and trying to sort of morph our functionality and how we write our code to the ORM to sort of appease the way things are being done by the ORM instead of the other way around. And then simple things like, let's say that we want to do a left join and we want to add a new field to a table. So for example, if we have a list of projects and we want to grab the status of the project from a different table, a simple thing like that with SQL would be very, very simple to do. It becomes very complicated to do because we have to deal with models in Laravel, let's say, in Active Record the same way. Even in Ecto, we need to add something to the schema, and then we need to ensure that it is nullable in type-safe languages like Go or Rust, and all of this complexity could have been avoided by simply creating a new struct, for example in Go, querying the database, putting the data into that new struct, and then returning that back from, let's say, an API, or if you're using something like HTMX, back to the browser inside of the HTML document. Again, these are the 5 reasons why I believe that you should learn how to use SQL if you're a web developer. Let me know in the comments below if you agree with this or if you think that an ORM is always enough. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.